There we go. Looks like we're live and rolling. Good morning, everyone. Today's February 21st, and it is 9 a.m. and we'll call to order the Legislative Audit Commission. We have two topics on the agenda today. We have the release of the Office of the Legislative Audit Petroleum Remediation Program, and then I added a topic, a discussion topic for all of us about all of the major activities that are happening and where there's been a tremendous outreach to Ms. Randall on how do we get some eyes on some activities that are occurring. So just wanted to bring it up and make sure we discuss it as a group holistically and get some ideas or think about how we move forward, if we need to move forward on anything outside of the processes we have in place today. So with that, let's move into the first order. Oh, let's do Ms. Randall, let's do a roll call. Is that Shelley, Ms. Gilb? Could you do a roll call, please, for us?
Good morning. This is Shelley Gilb, and I'll take the roll. Senator Cran.
Here.
Senator Benson. Representative Bernardi.
Present.
Representative Erickson.
Erickson present.
Senator Frentz. Representative Hansen.
Present.
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Present.
Senator Klein.
Here.
Representative Liebling. Representative Pearson.
Pearson present.
Representative Quam.
Present.
And Senator Rest. That ends the roll.
Well, thank you, Ms. Gilb. Thank you, Ms. Gilb.
Present.
Thank you, Ms. Gilb. With that, Ms. Randall, would you who would you like to kick off? Do you have a couple comments before we move into the actual report?
I do, Mr. Chair. Thank you. For the record, my name is Judy Randall. I'm legislative auditor, and I'm pleased to be here today to release our evaluation on the Petroleum Remediation Program, which is located within the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, MPCA. Petroleum is something that most of us use every day. It's in the fuel in our car, and it's how many of us heat our home. As you may know, petroleum is commonly stored in tanks that are located across the state. When a tank leaks, it can pose a threat to the environment or to human health. And this is where the Petroleum Remediation Program steps in. It responds to leaks from these tanks. While the Petroleum Remediation Program staff oversee the state's response to the leak, they're not the ones doing the actual cleanup work. They're not the ones on site investigating the leak. They're not the ones developing the plan to address the leak, and they're not the ones on site doing the actual cleanup. Instead, that work falls to environmental consultants. Unfortunately, what we found is that it is difficult for MPCA to hold these consultants accountable if they do poor quality work. The program staff request information from the consultants and they approve a cleanup plan or proposal, but the program staff cannot hold the consultants directly accountable if they do a poor job. So instead, if the work is not conducted satisfactorily, PCA, for example, can't penalize the consultant. They can't levy a fine. They can't sanction them. All they can do is direct the consultant to do additional work, which falls to the cost, which the owner of the tank, usually a private owner, has to pay for. So if it ends up being a cost to the tank owner, and frankly, it also ends up being a cost to the state because PCA staff have to then spend additional time overseeing the additional work and providing oversight. Oversight of these consultants is a difficult situation. It also involves the Petro Fund and it involves the Department of Commerce. So to dig, and we think this situation warrants an additional look by the legislature. So to dig into the details of this situation, but then also our additional findings and recommendations, I'd like to now turn to Ms. Caitlin Badger, who is the manager for our evaluation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Randall. Ms. Badger, could you please state your name and your position, and then the floor is yours.
Chair Cran, thanks very much. I'm going to pull up my slides here. Give me 1 second. Chair Coran, members, I want to thank you all for having us here this morning. Good morning. For the record, my name is Caitlin Badger. I'm with the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and I was the manager for this report. I just want to confirm that everybody can see the slides okay before I keep going. I'm getting a nod. Okay, great. Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my colleagues who assisted with this evaluation, Eleanor Berry and Will Harrison, both of whom are with us here today. And I'd also like to thank the Pollution Control Agency and their staff for all of their assistance throughout our evaluation. I'll start by providing a quick roadmap of my comments here today. I'll first provide a brief program overview before I highlight some of our key findings. Then I'll provide some additional information about how the Petroleum Remediation Program operates before focusing on the findings and recommendations that Ms. Randall alluded to regarding consultants that work on release sites. I'll wrap up with a discussion about requirements regarding low-risk release sites and a brief discussion about the extent to which the program considers how changes to contaminated properties could pose risks to people and the environment in the future. So first, a little bit of background. When petroleum products are inadvertently leaked or spilled, as Ms. Randall said, they can pose various health and environmental hazards, such as if petroleum contamination gets into a household's private drinking water well, for example, or if it affects the state's lakes and rivers. The goal of the Petroleum Remediation Program is to protect human health and the environment from risks posed by releases from petroleum storage tanks. It does this by overseeing the steps taken at release sites by the folks that ultimately address the release, such as tank owners or operators and environmental consultants. As you can see on the map here, petroleum release sites are located across the state. A release or a discharge of petroleum from a tank could result from a number of different types of situations. For example, a tank might overflow if someone overfills it, or a tank's pipes might have a loose connection that then results in a leak. The Petroleum Remediation Program was responsible for overseeing nearly 1,340 release sites reported in fiscal years 2017 through 2021. Nearly 2/3 of those release sites occurred on commercial properties, and the most commonly released types of petroleum products were gasoline, fuel oil, and diesel. So with that background, a few of our key findings here. First, there are minimal consultant registration requirements for the consultants that are working on petroleum release sites. Additionally, program staff expressed concerns about the quality of work conducted by some consultants. However, MPCA has limited authority to directly hold consultants accountable when they perform poorly. Additionally, statutes describe how MPCA must address sites that are considered a low potential risk. However, that term is not clearly defined. And finally, when making decisions about how to address a release, the Petroleum Remediation Program primarily focuses on risks posed by how the property is currently used and does not generally consider how changes to the property might pose risks in the future. So after a release is reported to MPCA, the site generally goes through a 4-phase process. First, MPCA must identify the individual or entity who is responsible for addressing the release. This person is referred to as the responsible party and is the tank owner or tank operator. Next, depending on the conditions at the site, the release may undergo an investigation. After an investigation, MPCA decides whether or not the contamination at the release site needs to be remediated through, for example, soil excavation or other remediation methods. And finally, if the site meets the program's criteria for case closure, MPCA staff may decide to close the case for the site. Once the case is closed, MPCA's regulatory oversight of the release is concluded. It's important to know that not all sites go through each of these 4 phases. For example, releases that are emergencies, such as if a train derails and is leaking petroleum, they're handled by a different organ or a different office within MPCA. And further, the program uses a risk-based approach to addressing release sites, which in other words means that the agency focuses its efforts on sites that pose a high risk to people and the environment. If MPCA decides that a site is not a high risk, then the agency may decide to let the contamination naturally degrade over time without further intervention. As we discuss more in the report, MPCA is not the only state entity that plays a role regarding petroleum tank releases, and I want to briefly introduce two state entities outside of MPCA that play an important role in this process. First, the Petroleum Tank Release Compensation Board, also called the Petro Fund Board, provides reimbursements to responsible parties for a share of the costs they incur in addressing the release. The board also has responsibility for registering consultants and contractors that work on petroleum remediation program sites. I'll talk about that more here shortly. Additionally, the Department of Commerce, which also provides staff to the Petro Fund Board, has authority to censure or fine consultants or to deny or revoke their registration for a number of different reasons, including if the consultant performs poor quality work. So next, I want to focus on this critical role that consultants play at release sites. MPCA does not conduct investigations or undertake mitigation activities themselves, as Ms. Randall referred to. Instead, this work is typically done by environmental consultants that are hired by the responsible party. Through their investigations, consultants determine the extent and the magnitude of the release. They also determine what risks the release poses to people in the environment. If the release needs to be remediated, consultants are responsible for conducting cleanup or other remediation activities and also measuring the effectiveness of those interventions. Consultants communicate their findings back to MPCA throughout the process through various reports, and based on the information that MPCA receives from consultants, the agency makes decisions about what actions need to be taken at release sites. Because of the critical role that consultants play on release sites, a number of our findings and recommendations focus on consultants. By law, consultants and contractors must register with the Petro Fund Board to work on release sites. However, consultant registration requirements are minimal. As we show in the report on page 36, by law, consultants must meet only 4 general criteria, such as obtaining and maintaining liability insurance and agreeing to abide by certain requirements in law. While statutes give the Petro Fund Board the authority to adopt rules requiring the certification of environmental consultants, the board has not adopted any such certification requirements. The board also does not consider a business's technical abilities when it decides whether or not to register that business. So given the large role that consultants play, we surveyed program staff about the quality of consultant work. Over half of petroleum remediation program staff said the overall quality of consultant work had a negative impact on the program's ability to meet its goals to protect human health and protect the environment. Similarly, over half of staff said the overall quality of consultant work negatively affected their ability to make scientifically sound decisions about release sites. As you can see on this slide, staff said poor consultant performance at least sometimes had other negative effects, including delaying case closure or creating additional costs. You can find additional information about consultant performance on in our report on page 38 to 39. While staff expressed concerns about consultant performance, I do want to note that several staff explained that performance varies from one consultant to the next. For example, one staff person said that some consultants conduct and provide really high quality reports while others do not. Although MPCA staff expressed continued concerns about the performance of some consultants, the program has implemented several strategies in an attempt to ensure that consultants conduct high quality work. For example, the program has created numerous guidance documents that describe how consultants should conduct their work. The program also has a field audit program, and as part of this program, petroleum remediation staff visit a sample of release sites to observe consultant performance out in the field and then make sure that the consultants are adhering to the program guidance as they do their work. However, MPCA has limited authority to directly hold consultants accountable when consultants perform poorly. Instead, the Petroleum Tank Release Cleanup Act gives the power to sanction or penalize consultants to the Department of Commerce. Further, because responsible parties directly contract with the consultants for most release sites, MPCA is limited in the extent to which it can hold consultants accountable through the contracting process. MPCA staff explained to us that rather than being able to hold consultants directly accountable for poor quality work, the agency holds them indirectly accountable through the responsible party. For example, through the responsible party, MPCA might direct the consultants to do more work or to redo aspects of their work. However, the costs of requiring consultants to do more work fall on the responsible party who has to pay the consultant for its work, and they also fall on the state to the extent that the state has to invest additional resources and staff time in trying to ensure that the consultant work meets expectations. The consequences don't fall directly on the poorly performing consultant. Given the significant role consultants play in addressing petroleum releases, it's critically important that consultants conduct high quality work. We provide several recommendations about ensuring consultants perform adequately. For example, we recommend that the legislature direct MPCA to work with the Department of Commerce in establishing a process for systematically holding consultants accountable for poor performance. As I mentioned earlier, the Department of Commerce, rather than MPCA, has the authority in law to sanction consultants when they perform poorly. These two agencies should figure out a formal process for communicating about repeated performance issues so they can better hold underperforming consultants accountable. Additionally, we recommend that the legislature direct MPCA to collaborate with the Petro Fund Board to study whether it is feasible and how they might establish technical qualifications needed to work at release sites. As I mentioned earlier, the Petro Fund Board is the entity with authority in law to establish those certification requirements for consultants. Unlike consultants working on petroleum remediation program sites, businesses that install, remove, or repair underground storage tanks, including storage tanks that contain petroleum, are required by law to meet certain technical requirements. We think that establishing minimal technical requirements could help reduce the quality or the frequency of poor quality consultant work. You'll notice in our recommendations that we suggest that these state entities take a collaborative approach to addressing issues of consultant performance. In conversations with Petro Fund Board and Commerce staff, they made it clear that they do not have the technical expertise nor the in-depth knowledge of consultant work that would be necessary to evaluate consultant performance. They explained that they would need to rely on MPCA staff to make determinations about the quality of consultant work. This is why we're recommending this collaborative approach rather than simply directing the Petro Fund Board or the Department of Commerce to implement these recommendations. I'm going to turn away now from our discussion about consultants and mention a few of our other key findings in the report. I mentioned before that MPCA takes a risk-based approach to addressing releases, and that for some sites, the agency lets petroleum contamination degrade naturally over time. According to state law, whenever an assessment of the site determines that there is a low potential risk to public health and the environment, MPCA is required to address the release with passive bioremediation. Passive bioremediation is not defined in law, but it typically refers to various physical, chemical, or biological processes that degrade the petroleum contamination naturally without human intervention. In other words, for release sites that the program staff determine are a low potential risk, statutes prohibit MPCA from actively cleaning up the site. In contrast, the Petroleum Tank Release Cleanup Act neither indicates whether MPCA is supposed to remediate release sites that are determined to be a high risk, nor does it describe how the agency is supposed to address petroleum contamination at those sites. We found that neither law nor the Petroleum Remediations Program guidance defines what characteristics or site conditions would make a site a low potential risk. It was also not clear whether agency staff were using passive bioremediation at all sites that would be classified as low risk. We recommend that MPCA define the characteristics of a site it would classify as low potential risk and to ensure that passive bioremediation is used at all low potential risk sites as required by law. If MPCA determines that there are release sites it would define as low potential risk for which it does not believe passive bioremediation would be an appropriate approach, the agency should recommend to the legislature that this requirement in law be amended. Last, I'd like to briefly discuss the extent to which MPCA considers how future changes to a property might pose risks resulting from petroleum contamination. As I mentioned, program staff may decide to close a release site's case when some petroleum contamination is still present at the site, as long as risks to human health and to the environment have been sufficiently addressed. However, the conditions that are present at a release site when staff decide to close the case could change potentially in the future. Program guidance largely instructs staff to consider only how that property is currently used when deciding what steps are necessary to protect human health and the environment at the site. Program guidance generally does not instruct staff to consider what risks there might be if there were changes to the site. For example, let's suppose there is an uninhabited building at the property. When MPCA evaluate what risks at the site could be there for humans, a staff person explained that the interventions that the agency decides may or may not be necessary are based on the fact that there's nobody living in that building. So if MPCA was then to close the case for that site and someone were to inhabit the building in the future, and then additional testing or intervention wasn't done to ensure the building was safe for occupancy, it's possible that the building occupants could be at risk of adverse effects from the petroleum contamination. However, while guidance generally instructs staff to only consider how a property is currently used, in our survey of staff, the staff actually varied in the extent to which they considered how a property might be used in the future when they made site decisions, as you can see on the graph here on this slide. MPCA staff had mixed opinions, both regarding whether or not it was possible to consider the future use of a property and the extent to which it was important to do so. So, for example, some staff said it's very difficult to know and plan for how a site might be used in the future if the site use is going to change. On the other hand, a few staff described limitations to not considering how a property might be used in the future, and that those limitations could put people at risk. Staff also described ways in which people might learn about petroleum contamination at properties they own or would like to buy in the future, so that hopefully they don't make changes to those sites that could potentially pose new risks. However, staff said that those mechanisms are not necessarily foolproof. We make two recommendations on this point. First, that MPCA should consider additional steps it could take to reduce risks resulting from future changes to petroleum contaminated properties, and also that MPCA should ensure staff take a consistent approach in the extent to which they consider how a property may be used in the future when they make site decisions. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll wrap up my comments for today. I'm happy to take questions or turn it over to MPCA, whatever you would prefer.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. I think what we'll do is we'll have MPCA provide their response, and then we'll do questions.
Thank you.
So I see a couple people here from MPCA who would like to take the lead position on it. Who do we have?
Chair and committee members, I could start if you'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Kudo. Could you please present your or state your name and your position prior to testifying?
Not a problem. Thank you, Chair and Commission members. My name is Kirk Kadelka. I'm an Assistant Commissioner with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I work on land issues, including our Petroleum Remediation Program. Thank you for this opportunity to share the MPCA's response to the Office of the Legislative Auditor's evaluation of the Petroleum Remediation Program. Before I start, I want to thank the OLA and its staff for the time spent learning about the work of the Petroleum Remediation Program, for providing an outside perspective and constructive feedback on the program. We're proud of this program, its outcomes, and our committed staff who are tireless to oversee, promote, and thoroughly investigate cleanup and closure of petroleum contaminated sites. Through this program, the agency advances our mission to protect and improve the environment and human health, specifically by ensuring Minnesotans have safe drinking water. The OLA's evaluation reaffirms our work. An example is the survey of professionals in this field, both inside and outside of the agency. Overwhelmingly, they agree we are achieving our goals of protecting human health and the environment. EPA has recognized our achievements in operating this program too. Minnesota is the only state in EPA Region 5 to achieve its goals for addressing leaking underground storage tank sites. In addition, EPA acknowledges our willingness to continue to improve our program by not only incorporating new science and technology advancements into our program, but also looking back at old contaminated sites using this new knowledge. We're committed to improving it and have built a culture where learning is valued. As such, we'll use the OLA's recommendation to further improve our program. As the OLA's evaluation notes, we previously started some continuous improvement projects that once completed can help achieve some of the recommendations. We've also identified additional ideas that we can easily adopt to address other recommendations. I'd like to take a little time to touch on some of the OLA's recommendations and efforts we are taking to address them or will in the near future. In regards to the quality of consultants' work, we agree with the OLA's findings that when consultants produce poor work products, it has a negative impact on our efforts. However, as noted, these incidents are limited. It's also true we have no direct authority over the ability to penalize a consultant who is hired by the responsible party to carry out the work. However, we feel it's important to provide some context on what authorities the MPCA does have to ensure contaminated sites are properly addressed. Owners and operators of storage tanks are responsible for their releases. The owner and operator is ultimately the responsible party under law. Consultants are just hired to complete the work. The agency has clear authority over those responsible parties, and we exercise those authorities to ensure contamination is addressed. When consultants' work don't meet our standards, we require the consultant through the responsible party, the ultimate responsible party, to correct it. This at times, as noted, can cause delays and potential cost increases, but it's important to note it doesn't impact the quality of our work done at contaminated sites. In order to prevent it from becoming a problem, the program provides guidance and training to consultants, such as Consultant Stay. We also have a field audit program, as mentioned, where we make unannounced visits to check on the quality of consultants' work. We concur with the OLA's finding that additional improvements are needed. It's why this spring we launched the first phase of a report evaluation and performance oversight team, known as REPORT. It's the start of an effort to improve the quality of materials submitted to us by consultants. We're also willing to work with the legislature and the Department of Commerce to discuss other strategies to satisfy this recommendation. In regards to evaluating risk from contamination, the program utilizes a risk-based approach for addressing petroleum releases. It's a well-defined and studied method implemented by all other states. An MPCA's specific approach is approved by the EPA. We don't put Minnesotans' health on a sliding scale, so we divide contaminated sites into two categories. As the OLA report acknowledges, we clearly define the criteria for high-risk sites, which pose greater risk to human health and the environment. These are also the sites that need corrective actions. By definition, all other sites are considered low risk and can be addressed through passive bioremediation or no action due to the low risks being present. OLA has recommended that we clearly define low risks. We can easily accommodate this by more clearly articulating that high and low risk definition relationship, that low risk sites are those that do not meet the high risk criteria. We can also tag sites as either low or high risk in our database to aid in future tracking. In regards to considering future risk, as much as possible, the MPCA considers a future risk of a potential exposure to contamination. However, this is complex and difficult because several conditions could change into the future. For example, how a site is used, new toxicity data on a contaminant, and science and technology improvements. As a result, no single mechanism guarantees complete protection. It's why we use a belts and suspenders approach, where multiple mechanisms are stronger than any one. It's important that several parties work together to provide this protection against unknown future risk. It consists of 4 parts, and many of which are beyond just the MPCA's guidance and work. The first party is the MPCA. Our staff considers future factors when known at the time of a corrective action. For instance, future design changes for the property or how the local government has actually zoned the property. Second, owners and sellers. They must disclose information about the contamination on their property under specific and general provisions already in Minnesota law. We've worked with the Minnesota realtors to improve the system by adding prompt questions in their standard disclosure materials, so buyers and owners have the information they need. The third party is buyers and owners. They have an ability to access many tools on the MPCA's website for information about past and present contamination. We're improving these tools by adding more sites to the Minnesota Groundwater Atlas, which is an excellent resource recently funded by the legislature. Developers and lenders are the fourth and final group. It's standard lending practice for developers to obtain assurances that contamination issues are addressed based on the type of development. MPCA's Brownfield program was created to assist in these specific situations. We agree the recommendation that further review could benefit this area of future risk. To meet this recommendation, we can use an existing future risk continuous improvement project selected by our staff and supported by leadership that is part of our consistent and cleanup effort project. In summary, we appreciate the OLA's evaluation of the Petroleum Remediation Program and its recognition of the outcome of our dedicated and hardworking staff. Our agency strives to be a learning organization with a culture that values innovation and ingrains improvement into our everyday work. We will use the OLA's evaluation in our efforts to continuously improve the quality of our work in order to achieve our goals. We are committed to our mission to protect our environment and the health of Minnesotans. Thank you, Chair and Commission members, for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Kudelka. Mr. Kudelka, I've got a quick question. On the one of the recommendations of the qualifications of those consultants, and one of the recommendations was to that the MPCA could request to the Petro Board to improve or define those criteria more clearly. Has the MPCA made requests to the Petro Board to do that in the past? Mr. Kudelka?
Mr. Chair and committee members, we would like to have that conversation with the legislature and others. It is a complex issue where there are pros and cons to any of these changes. I don't have information on what the past conversations have been, but we are interested in moving forward on this.
Thank you, Mr. Kudelka. You can understand the concern. It looks like, you know, if the survey or the findings were from MPCA itself, and knowing that the Petroleum Board could make those or are in a position to make those 12 recommendations and tighten up the consultant, that we assume you would have made those requests long before the OLA or the report would recommend it. So we're just looking for that history. Thank you, Mr. Kudelka. We have Senator Kiffmeyer. Question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for you, Mr. Kudelka. I'm seeing here that MPCA has established qualifications and certification for contractors who install, remove, or repair underground storage tanks, including petroleum storage tanks. So I'm a little bit puzzled as to something that is really important, such as spills or leaks, things like that. Could you explain why they wouldn't even go there without having the OLA report? What would be the reason for not doing so?
Mr. Kudelka?
Mr. Chair and committee members, I do have a colleague here with me, Jamie Wallerstedt, our Division Director for Remediation. She can touch base a little bit on what we put into our actual master contracts that are the consultants that work for us. You know, that, and I'll just start off a little bit above that. You know, those are additional qualifications that we can look to. And as the OLA said, that's a conversation we'd like to have with the legislature and also the Petro Board and Department of Commerce to see if those make sense. We do have some different contracting requirements as a state than other entities might, and what a responsible party might have. And ultimately, it is the responsible party's ability and also their responsibility to be able to select an actual one, their consultant and that.
Thank you. And do you have additional comments from Ms. Wallerstedt to Senator Kiffmeyer's question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair and Senator. My name is Jamie Wallerstedt. I'm the Division Director for Remediation at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And as Assistant Commissioner Kirk Kudelka stated, where we are performing the work when there is no responsible party or the responsible party is not cooperative, where the MPCA is doing the work or the state is doing the work, we do have a master contract that does, it's a very rigorous process. We went out for a request for proposal and we have a number of contractors on that contract. And we do have a number of requirements. They had to, submit their information as whether they were a qualified consultant. That was reviewed by our contract staff at the MPCA and also our internal staff. So that is something that we do have in place at this point in time.
Thank you, Ms. Wallerstedt.
Mr.
Senator
Chair,
Kiffmeyer?
yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand that, and that was going to be my next question about the contracts. That's when it's the MPCA, and you have a ton of staff, attorneys, all kinds of analysts and people who can do this. The purpose of registration or certification is to help the private individuals who would be in a situation of not having all the attorneys and all the staff that MPCA or the Petrofund Board and others do. And so having a stronger registration is very weak. Those requirements are very minimal. And especially to maybe some of these low risk, when they want to do this, they might be trusting, well, they're on this registration list and thinking it is more akin to certification. Now, they ought to know their business, and I hear you in saying that. Nonetheless, from what I'm seeing here, you have all the authority you need right now to go ahead and do this certification and make that stronger. Question I have for you as well, maybe for Ms. Wallerstein, is do you make those kinds of master contracts or a template contract for other individuals to use, such as what you use when MPCA is doing the work?
Ms. Wallerstein?
Thank you, Chair and Senator. Yes, once the contract is executed with the state of Minnesota, it is public information.
That's, Mr. Chair.
Senator Kiffmeyer?
Yeah, thank you. That's not quite what I meant, Ms. Wallerstead. So let me make it more clear. Do you have, not for you, MPCA and your master contract, make it public, do you have a template contract that goes on your site that the private sector could use, the private independent parties that may own the property or own the equipment? Do you have something that is a guideline contract for them to use so that they might benefit from what you do as MPCA when you're doing the work? I hope that came across more clear.
Ms. Wallerstein?
Yes, thank you, Chair and Senator. Yes, that was more clear. We do not have template contracts on our website. However, we do have a number of guidance documents in which we essentially lay out all aspects of the investigation. So.
Okay.
Thanks.
So, Mr.
Thanks,
Chair,
Ms.
just, yeah, I just
Senator
want to do, yeah, thank you. I just want to do a final comment. You know, I see some good things in here, and especially the letter response. I always really appreciate that because the OLA does a really good job. They work hard and I think provide a real service to you, the agency, as well as to all people on documenting and putting things down. And I'm glad to see the seriousness with which you are taking it. But I see a little bit of a, it's their problem, the private sector. And I think as an agency funded with tax dollars, you could be more helpful in regards to this, whether it's certification or strengthening things so that it's not just a benefit to you and the MPCA, but also do more to help the private parties. So when they're relying upon that, and especially the low risk, I think the high risk, you guys take a great deal and do a lot of stuff there, but I'm just thinking of those, and I think it may be an area that you could focus on. That's my comment for now, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer. Representative Hanson, before we get to your question, I do have a follow-up to Senator Kiffmeyer following that line of question from Ms. Wilson. So on the contract, for the work you do with MPCA, I understand the procurement process extremely well. So you believe in that case, I'd like to know that you have the tools necessary, you have a rigorous qualification or an open procurement process with SLAs, I assume, and consequences. Have we removed consultants under that contract that haven't performed to the level we believe necessary under the state's contracted work? Ms. Walson?
Thank you, Chair. To my knowledge, we have not removed a consultant from our master contract. We do have annual reviews. Like we said, we do field audits. We provide timely feedback to all consultants. And more often than not, consultants correct any sort of deficiencies that they have on our work.
Ms. Wallace, thank you, Ms. Wallace. And then, so with that, so are we to take that the OLA report of the lack of performance or qualifications for consultants that are highlighted in this report are exclusively only those hired by the private companies? Ms. Foster?
Mr. Chair.
So Mr. Kudelka?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and committee members, we do have additional requirements there. I know that OLA has looked into this, the difference between our contracting and those of the private sector. And I don't know if they could shed some light too on their findings. We do have a higher standard for our own contractors because of the requirements under state law on the contracting. And as noted, we have limited authority, as the OLA noted in their report, to do that for consultants. But I think they can help a little bit with that question too.
Thank you, Mr. Kudelka. Yes, and you have limited authority, but you also haven't defined that you have the ability to request higher criteria by the Petroleum Board, and it doesn't appear you've done that either. So, Ms. Badger, could you provide clarification on the last question I had?
Mr. Chair, thanks. It's a good question. I think first off, we do talk briefly in the report about there are some additional requirements, as you referred to, that MPCA does require of the consultants that it contracts directly with. For example, I believe there are some requirements that they have some more technical training than the requirements that are out there that the Petrofund board has established. I will note one thing that I think is just a helpful piece of context. I mentioned that we looked at all release sites that were reported within fiscal 17 through 2021. And just to give a sense of sort of the share of how these sites break down, of all of those sites, only 4% of the sites that we looked at were those sites where MPCA then directly contracts with the consultants. The vast majority of the sites within our review were what they consider responsible party-led sites, if you will, where the responsible party is directly contracting with the consultant or the contractor. And so, we spent the bulk of our efforts looking at those sorts of issues because within our data set, that was the vast majority of the cases.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. And we'll go to Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to drill down a little bit into the risk questions because it's intriguing to me that we don't define risk, at least in statute. And so my question is there, Ms. Badger or Ms. Wallerstedt, does the agency incorporate new science? Is there like any peer reviewing or we've learned a lot since the petroleum program was established. Our ability to detect things has improved. We have the capacity to find other things that go along with petroleum. There could be other contaminants, other chemicals that are depending on the gasoline mix or whether it's kerosene or petroleum or oil. So what is the integration of keeping up with science and including that into risk? Because what may have been low risk 30 years ago may not be low risk now, depending on what we know.
Mr. Chair,
Sorry.
you're muted.
Ms. Wallerstedt and Ms. Badger, who would like to take the first shot at that? Representative Hanson's question.
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair and Commission members. We do incorporate new findings into our work, and it's done through recommendations of staff or other institutions. So I want to go through a couple examples. One is vapor intrusion. As Chair Hanson, this is something that has been very important for our work. Within the last 2 decades, we've become aware of groundwater plumes not only pose a risk to drinking water, but can have vapors that go into people's homes. And so we were one of the first states to incorporate that into our guidance. And then we were actually worked with others to help incorporate a national model. We worked with what we call ITRC, which is a collaboration of public entities, academic and private entities to build guidance there. We also helped build in some of our information about biofuels. We were one of the first 2 states to incorporate how do you handle ethanol in the petroleum spills, and then help to build guidance that way. Another example is we're continuing to learn. We have 2 look back programs and they deal with that information. So not only are we looking at how to incorporate these new concepts into our program moving forward, we have a look back program for vapor intrusion and lead gas additives. So we're going back to sites now that we have information that we didn't have decades ago, looking back at these sites and seeing, with this new knowledge, are there other risks there that we weren't aware of? And so this is an important piece. So we're building it into it as we have new information into guidance moving forward, and then have identified areas where there has been some major changes to go back and look at them. And this way it is a double approach to be able to do this. For instance, we have continuous improvement projects right now, looking at a new way to look at health risk limits because of petroleum products with the Department of Health. And then we also have our continuous improvement projects on future risk and plume stability, for instance, which are across all of our remediation programs to help improve our consistency and continue to incorporate the best practices of all of our programs and the rest of the nation.
Thank you, Mr. Kudelka. Representative Hanson, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe if Ms. Badger could mention just how OLA looked at that. And, I'm concerned that the PCA can have those internal programs, but if the statute doesn't keep up with the times, then there's exposure in terms of liability or inability to force a cleanup. And really the bottom line here is protection of the public health and the environment, and how do we make sure we have the best possible laws to make sure that it happens. So I'd like OLA's review of how that is incorporated and what specifically we need in terms of statutory correction.
Thank you, Representative Hanson. Mr. Kudelka.
Mr. Chair, committee members, I think that was the first to go to the OLA, and then I think us for follow-up.
Sorry, Ms. Randall. Or Ms. Badger.
Chair Curran, thank you. Chair Curran and Representative Hanson, it's an important question, I think, that you're asking. I'll say 2 things briefly about it. One, to sort of Mr. Kudelka's point about the internal guidance. We did survey program staff and as the consultants and contractors that work on these sites to sort of ask about the adequacy of the Petroleum Remediation Program's current guidance documents. And we did ask them sort of their thoughts on the scientific adequacy, if you will, of the guidelines and the guidance documents that the program has right now. At least 70% of the respondents that we surveyed said that the program has sufficiently scientifically rigorous guidance documents. And then over 60% said those guidance documents are updated in a timely manner to reflect scientific advancements in the field. So I wanted to just note that, since Mr. Kudelka was talking about sort of some of the internal things that the agency is doing. But I think Representative Hanson, to your point about sort of what's in law, really, regarding this, particularly this passive bioremediation requirement, I think you make an important point to consider, in that you're right. The understanding about petroleum and how petroleum degrades and sort of the conditions that may be needed in the environment for petroleum to effectively degrade, and whether or not even all aspects of the petroleum will actually degrade in time. I think the understanding of that area of science has changed a lot since that passive bioremediation requirement was put in law. That requirement has been in law for quite some time. I think our recommendation to MPCA is that the agency sit down and define what is a low potential risk site. But I mentioned in the presentation, and we talk about this in the report, that I think if MPCA, in taking into account all of those sort of scientific advancements and increased understanding about how natural degradation of petroleum occurs, I think if the agency feels like they can't, that there are potentially low risk sites for which they don't think it's appropriate to basically leave that site untouched after sort of an investigation has taken place, we do recommend that the agency keep that in mind, and then work with the legislature as they move forward if they really do feel like that passive bioremediation requirement needs to sort of be refreshed in time. And I do think I mentioned too, there's a bit of a discrepancy in terms of the law describes how MPCA should handle these low potential risk sites, but it doesn't have this sort of equivalent discussion or requirement about high-risk sites. And so I do think there's certainly things there for MPCA to think about in terms of us recommending that they define what a low potential risk site is there. But I think we also wanted to elevate that to the legislature's attention because there is a little bit of a difference in terms of how law treats low potential risk versus high risk sites.
Mr. Kudelka?
Thank you, Chair and committee members. As mentioned, there is the definition of high-risk site in our guidance documents. And so that does incorporate the new technologies and scientific learnings, including toxicity information. I'll go back to the example of vapor intrusion. We did not have a law change during that period of time, but the way the law is written, allowing the agency, giving it the permission when it believes human health and the environment are at risk, to be able to require responsible party to take on those actions. So we do believe that the law is flexible enough for us to incorporate new science, technology advancements, and that as we move forward in the way we protect human health and the environment. As noted, we do have those 14 criteria for high-risk sites, and those are based on what are those impacts to humans or to the environment, which can incorporate in new threats such as soil vapor or other things that we learn about.
Thank you, Mr. Kudelka. Representative Hansen, follow up?
Well, it's been a while since I've been in school. Maybe Representative Erickson would help on this, but 70% and 60% would be a C and a D. So I think we could do better.
Thank you, Representative Hansen. Representative Erickson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Representative Hansen. You're correct. 60 and 70 are not passing grades. But I want to thank Ms. Badger for the excellent work that she has done. This is not my area of expertise, and so this has really been a learning experience. And again, I always have a concern about have we written the statute specifically enough to address so many of these issues? So I think it's always good for legislators to take a look at the recommendations that come from these audits to see if over time we shouldn't be modifying what's in statute so that we don't have these kinds of issues coming up. So anyway, thank you to the OLA. Thank you to MPCA for their excellent response to this. And I hope that we can move forward with some change if it's needed, but I hope we'll have good debate about it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Erickson. And you do mention a finer point of it's educational, but also our role as the Legislative Audit Commission with the COVID and the remoteness and our lack of meeting and bringing each of these reports. We are going to bring all reports to this body for a thorough vetting. We have an important role to serve, and we appreciate everybody involved. So we are going to go back and make sure, as you've noticed the last couple of reports, we're going to make sure that we get every one of them the exposure and the highlight that's needed for our citizens. A lot of these reports are taken up randomly based on the committee and the topic, but not all of them. And so we'll make sure that we get these highlighted so we understand where the deficiencies are, whether it be legislative, agency-wise. We'll continue to move forward and make sure we serve Minnesota in the best manner. So I don't see Representative Erickson, your hand is still up. I think you're through. I don't see any other questions. Last call for questions for everybody here. All right. Well, we appreciate Mr. Kudelka and staff in your report. And then what I'd like to move on is to the next conversation is really just for discussion. Just to start the conversation, Ms. Randall has been bombarded, as she is with every other facet of the role of the Office of the Legislative Auditor. There's some high profile activities that are going on, and she's being requested to look at Southwest Light Rail. We talk about the rental assistance program. Southwest Light Rail is what, $700 million of overruns and years of extended due dates. You got the rental assistance program. Well, $600 million went through the program. What and where did it go when we as the legislature get no information from the agencies responsible? There's a great demand to look at those things. Feeding our future. Hundreds of millions of dollars, and we hear about these things in the news before we hear about them as legislators first off. And to me, that should never happen. Department of Economic and Employment Development. I think the national number of stolen UI or fraud was upwards of $420 billion. The agency's still not provided the chair of the Senate committee. What is Minnesota's component to that? What are those things? And so I wanted to bring up the conversation. Ms. Randall's done a great job in talking about and taking immediate action on practically everything that's been brought before her. The reason I wanted to have the card, just to put your thinking caps on, is how do we need to move, if we need to move forward on some of these items? I don't think our world gets easier or simpler, or that the thieves are going to go away. And so how do we as a commission, is there a process that we should take or define, or at least talk about, to make sure we first and foremost preserve the Legislative Audit Commission and the bipartisan work that we've done in every aspect, not only for us, but for the OLA. But when these things come forth, how do we make sure that we get the eyes on these programs, and the timeliness is important. And so that's really what the conversation, what I just wanted to bring up to everybody, because there's multiple pieces of legislation that are kind of directing the OLA to do certain things. Should there be recommendations and how we move forward? And it falls into every aspect of doing what we think this program does best. It is the only eyes and ears for the citizens and the legislative body. All of these things hit the headlines. When do we take action? How do we take action? And we have things in place that the OLA has great discretion on and can take many of them things up. She doesn't have unlimited staff. And as well as we have the topic selection process that works, but some of these I think are of high enough priority that we may need to at least talk about how could we move forward and absolutely make sure that we move forward in a bipartisan manner if we all agree there is a path to do something different than what we have in place. So that was my thoughts. And Ms. Randall, if you would like to add a couple comments, your comments, and then it's just open for comments from members. Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members, and I appreciate the conversation. It has been an interesting month or so with a lot of requests coming to us in a lot of different ways. And I would say there's no right way to get a request to us. I mean, I have received direct letters. I have read about things in a press release, and I have had bills that have directed us to do work. As you know, we have a long history of trying to work with members so that a law does not direct our work. I think that takes away the prerogative of the Audit Commission to do that, and I think that's important. And it also takes away the independence of OLA, which has discretion to determine which special reviews we're going to embark on and which financial audits to take up, in large part based on our resources. As Mr. Chair said, we do have limited resources, and we're trying to use them to find the places where we can have the most value. So what I have been doing is, any request that comes to me, I take incredibly seriously. I try to communicate with the legislators that are initiating the request. And in a lot of cases, we can address things through maybe through a limited scope of a special review. Requests that are broad really are suitable for program evaluation. And that is clearly in law the prerogative of the Legislative Audit Commission. And so I have been working with members, and members have been very receptive. I want to emphasize that, and I really appreciate that. They've been very receptive to my conversations with them, talking about the prerogative of the Audit Commission to direct the work of the program evaluations. I mean, kind of what type of review falls into program evaluation versus a special review, which is necessarily more limited. And then financial audits are yet a different type of review. But I do think it requires kind of a constant beating of the drum by Audit Commission members to remind their members about the prerogative of the Audit Commission, to remind members kind of the different processes we have for those different types of reviews. And I will just put in another plug that this is the last week for members to suggest topics for topic selection. Like, this is the perfect time to tee up the topics people want evaluations on. And I've gotten very few requests. So yeah, there's a couple of high profile ones that have gotten a lot of attention. But we have not received a large number of topics through the standard process, which is underway as we speak. We will be sending out an email today to members and staff, reminding them that Friday is the due date. But that's really the mechanism that the Audit Commission has established. I think it's worked really well over time. You know, we are trying to be nimble to help members address these important concerns. I mean, the issues that have come to us are important. And so balancing, again, trying to help members get answers to important questions while also, managing limited resources. So, Mr. Chair, I hope that's maybe
Thanks,
helpful.
Ms. Randall. I'm glad you covered it very well. I mean, but we wanted to bring it up, if for nothing else, that all of our members understand the demands upon the agency and the interest of these high profile activities and what are we doing? Because then we're all better armed to make sure and work with all of our members within each of our caucuses to move forward. And it's even better if there's few topic selections that we can put the high priority ones up there. And if they truly do have bipartisan support, they will absolutely float to the top, which it appears they all do. But that was the intent of having the conversation. But the other piece too is even today with what you have and the nimbleness that you have is very limited by your staff. And so I think you have 7 financial audit positions that are open. We probably are going to need to figure out what else can we do to try and augment that, because that work is critical with what you have today. So as a legislative audit commission, we should probably talk about, again, just wanted the conversation, but what are those other things that are impeding our ability to do the work we need done today? And if we got to get creative, let's talk about what those options are. So thanks, Ms. Randall. Representative Erickson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Randall, would you prefer then that because my caucus has been busy coming up with topics, I've been collecting those and we're getting our list ready to send to you. But would you prefer that we separate program from financial from special reports so that when we send these ideas to you, there will be those that definitely are program because that's supposed to be what we're sending to you. But I also, and I know you've talked to some of our members in my caucus about special reports as well as financial audits. So would you prefer that we separate those out when we send you our list? Because we'll send it on time.
Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr.
And we
Chair.
Ms. Randall, we also give Representative Erickson an A because of how well that you're organized in getting the topics forwarded. So thank you, Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Erickson. Yes, Representative Erickson is an organizer extraordinaire, I would say, related to topic selection. I would say send us all your topics because we may be able to provide a different lens to them and be able to better determine what type of approach would make the most sense. I do try to steer as many as possible onto the program evaluation list because that gives the Audit Commission the most input, and I think that's important. There are some, and then through the topic selection process, sometimes I am able to help members say, we can say, well, maybe we can address this a different way and we can get creative. So I would say you go ahead and send it to us. If there's some that are clearly financial audit, then feel free to note that. But I think we can navigate that if we have the topics that you're interested in. Thanks.
Thanks, Ms. Randall. Representative Liebling, great to see you today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I wasn't completely prepared for this conversation, but today I don't know if we had it on the agenda, but I'm glad we're having it. I wonder if Ms. Randall or her staff have a document that clearly lays out and defines, or if we even have definitions of what these various kinds of reviews are. And I fully understand the problem, and it is sort of the nature of our bodies to respond to the news cycle. And when there's something big in the news, I think it's not unreasonable for members to say, oh my gosh, we need to investigate this, but it doesn't always mean that it's a good thing a good fit for the OLA. In many cases, there could be another entity already investigating. It could be something that they don't have the best, the best skill set for. I don't know. There could be a lot of reasons why those things are, while they cry out for investigation, they may not be a good OLA investigation topic. And I do think we need to, I think Ms. Randall's right on, and you're right on, Mr. Chair. We need to really think this through more. I'm not sure we're going to come up with the answer today. This is kind of a long-standing discussion, I think, too. But I do think if we could start with maybe trying to work on some definitions of what, or if there are some, of what would fit in each of these buckets. And if there's a large investigation that comes out of the news cycle, like the light rail investigation, which sounds to me like it would be just an enormous lift. I mean, very, very important. I don't think there's anybody who's saying, no, don't investigate. Somebody should be investigating. But, you know, it's an enormous lift. And, you know, that for sure should not be done, just undertaken. Maybe it should be defined in terms of dollar amount or staff resource or something that has a line where it has to come back to the audit commission so that there's complete buy-in to designate a certain huge pot of resource. And also, I think there's more of a tendency when it comes out of the news cycle, you know, there is a tendency for it to be more of a political issue. And I think that that's what we want to avoid. We want to, as you said, Mr. Chair, we want to make sure we've got bipartisan and, of course, bicameral buy-in when we are going to designate a lot of resource from the OLA. So for sure. And anyway, that's my piece that I wanted to say, and I hope we'll continue to have this conversation. But if there's a document that kind of lays it out, we should perhaps look at it and then maybe get it out to members so that we can say in a little more neutral way, you know, here's what, when you have that urge to call the OLA, look at this document first and make sure that it fits in one of these buckets.
Representative Liebling, and yes, we added this topic quickly. It was really just to open the conversation when there's so many things that we've lost over the last couple of years in just basic structure, form, policy, getting our legs back under us to get to do the business that we need to do under the OLA and in this commission. I can tell you, I guarantee you, we're not going to do one thing that could ever put this body in jeopardy, the best bicameral element of government oversight that exists. But it is important for us to look at what are all those activities that are occurring out there, the pressure that Ms. Randall's been on, you know, whether they hit the headlines or not. There's many other requests out there. So there was no goal to take any action. And I think Ms. Randall defined a clear path for practically everything that's been tossed her way. But it was more for the point of let's talk about it. And I think your education component about how we move forward and make sure that all of our members understand the absolute role that the OLA plays. I'm not sure people understand it. So it'd be a good time for a review as this entire legislature does a kind of a little reboot. So and you have my commitment, and I think that's one of the greatest parts about being with this commission is that the bipartisan, bicameral support and the desire to keep this functioning at the highest level possible is shared by me, and I believe every single member on there, and it will be preserved for as long as we're blessed to serve. So thanks, Representative Lee. Representative Kwan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, you know, frankly, I didn't think of it as being political. And if something has cost overruns that are order of magnitude greater than, or even 2 orders of magnitude greater than the inflation rate, red flags should pop out. And if there is sufficient documentation to where it's felt that it's justified to increase or, you know, the funding, basically our topics come from legislators. And I know that when something, you know, hits the news, we probably get a lot more calls. But I think it's common sense when we had the issue with the medical overruns or incorrect billing, you know, yeah, those hit the news media, but we as legislators need to understand what is happening to be good fiduciary, you know, people for the state. And so just because something is hot in the news, we can settle it down and say, you know, let's have a review, or maybe what we've done in the past on big topics, you know, some of the HHS things, we've done a sampling. So we pick a period of time and we sample and we get an idea, and that lets us know if there needs to be a larger, or if it just is something that we hadn't expected. And then as legislators, we can take that knowledge and improve our bills, our legislation, and the statutory processes to prevent unexpected occurrences. We know things are going to change, but the best we can do is be informed on why. So I have maybe a little different viewpoint on this, but I think it's good that we actually start talking about it and think about how we might approach it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Quam. And I think we're all on the same page. And I just wanted to have it because interestingly enough, every topic I listed really has great bipartisan support. And Ms. Randall's described the ability to address practically every one of them to make sure that we don't move into legislature and statute or through the legislative process lawmaking, tie their hands. But it highlights the great pressure that we have on all of us to get these things done. And I agree with you. We've got more things going on of equal or greater need in our program evaluations. You think about just grants overall. And one of the reasons for removing the single audit was to free up the ability to go into some of those deeper program reviews that we've never done before. So those are occurring, but I wanted to have the conversation and just have the feedback. But I do think the other part is that OLA has the ability to do the things we're asking, except for there's a massive staff shortage. We also know that's nothing new for any other entity around, but the work that we're doing is so critical in that office that we're going to have to maybe think about some creative ways to make sure to get more resources, or other things are going to fall off the plate, and our inability to react and utilize the processes we have in place will be challenged. So, Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a good discussion, and it kind of flows off of what we've been talking about for the last few years. One is, does the special review section need to be a section? You know, should there be a deputy auditor with a separate profile there? Because, you know, it kind of ebbs and flows on the requests that come in as a special review, and should there be some criteria there where they're handled? You know, so it's not just Mr. Alter having to deal with everything. And these are, as was mentioned, some very large things. I think we have moved back to a bipartisan kind of questioning of the mandates through statute, where we've had laws come where they used to say shall and now they say may. Again, I think we've come back to that, which recognizes the role of the commission. However, as the chair and others have mentioned, some of these are very big. And I guess if there are, and I know, Ms. Randall, you've been working particularly on the Southwest Light Rail one, of if there's through the legislative process, open discussion about this, and more importantly, an appropriation that pays for some work. I think that, you know, as long as we know that that has happened, rather than having a shall put in somewhere in a conference committee, that's the concern I have. I think that, you know, because the number of these are very big, you know, that it would swamp the whole audit. And then finally, you know, and I think today's report is a good example. We have an audit on something where there is litigation, which has received quite a bit of press with a whistleblower, you know, and I think we try to make sure that we are not involved in litigation. And I think that circles back to the discussions we've had about data practices and issues. So when there are, not on the one we're talking about today, but other things where there is fraud and federal investigations and that, I think, In the past, the audit staff have come in as necessary if there'd been an inquiry, but letting the investigatory process of the criminal justice system play out, and then we may have a different role. So I think those are three things we just need to be kind of aware of as this discussion goes on, and how do we define each of them?
Yep, thank you, Representative Hanson. And again, I appreciate everybody's comments, and so everybody's aware what's going on today in the pressures. We just wanted to open it up. I think I love the feedback because I think we all share this the same goals. And again, I don't think the requests are going to be diminished. The scale and scope of the thieves that are attacking our government entities is fairly large, and so we'll be aware of it. But I think that probably the highlight of the conversation is going to be around the topics are there. We have everything in place, but if we don't have staff in place to be able to do it, we're going to have some real deficiencies. So I think we'll have to get our creative thinking hats on. And Ms. Randall, you know, if there's some staff augmentation of some sort that would benefit based on the current priorities, we need to talk about those things, and so we move forward. So, Ms. Randall, any comments? I'll give you the last word based on what you just heard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I really do appreciate the thoughtful conversation around this. You know, of course, I'm going to commit to working with you all to figure out a right path forward. We did make some, or you all made some changes last session to acknowledge our role related to special reviews. So it's a step toward creating its own division. And I will note that based on feedback from the Audit Commission in 2020, 2019, I've lost sight of years. We do now have 2 staff in our special review division, if you will. So it's not just Mr. Alter. We now have a special review auditor to help. And so, you know, it's a doubling of the staff in that unit. So that's great. But, you know, I do think there's some discussion to be had about, you know, possibly expanding that group. Honestly, I don't want to make it too big, though. You know, I think an important aspect of our role is to review everything that comes in. We do preliminary inquiries on everything that comes in, and then figure out where it makes the most sense. And so it's kind of an endless stream of demand. And I think it's responsible for us to make some decisions about the best ways to deploy those resources. But I'm certainly open to conversations about how can we structure OLA to be most responsive and provide the most valuable information to the legislature. And if that means some reconfiguring, I'm certainly open to that. So thanks for starting the conversation.
Excellent. Thanks, Ms. Randall, and I appreciate everybody's comments. And with that, it's about 10:18. I see no hands, and many people are running off. The morning has begun. Committees are running. So appreciate everybody's comments and questions. We'll meet again in the very near future. And with that, we'll adjourn the Legislative Audit Commission for today. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.